up and you know you've been dreaming. You can remember there, if you focus what you were dreaming about. As I conclude the message, I'll just have to be honest with you and tell you what God impressed on me. I'll just have to conclude the message with honesty this morning. But right now we're going to talk about that process, that thought process, that processor, the brain. We're going to talk about the processor, that thing that people say. You hear people say, well, we use 10% of our brain. Well, I'll have you know I don't buy that, not for a second. I'm up to 11.5%, almost 12% myself. And there's nowhere to go but up sometimes. But no, that is what people say. And then others, if you read about that, they'll say that's simply not true at all. We use a great deal of our brain. We're just not as efficient as we should be. But Proverbs, how important is it? How we think, how important is it? Proverbs 23 and verse 7 says this: "For as he thinks in his heart, so is he." So we're thinking with our heart. I knew that we work in close conjunction with our mind and our heart and our mind. Proverbs says, as he thinks in his heart, so is he. That's probably pretty familiar scripture to you. But our mouths tend to follow right after that process. That two-step process, the mind and the heart, our mouths are usually the next thing that get in gear. And then sometimes we follow with our hands and our feet with action. But I guarantee you, that thing that you think, that thing that's in your heart, that's who you really are. And that's what that's saying. Colossians 3 says this: if you were raised, if, it starts out with the word if. Colossians 3, if then you were raised with Christ, are you? If you were raised with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ is, sitting at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on things on the earth. It tells us right here, we need to set our mind. Now, we're not robots, we're individuals. We all have our unique and individual thought process. Colossians 3 says, set your mind. This is a very important message today. Very important message. Everything that I've ever done, everything that I've neglected to do, it's been because of my thought process, which at times hasn't been that great. But we have a thought process and we have control over it. Believe me, I just said something that is the truth. We have a thought process and we have control over it if we choose to do so. Let's look at Romans 12. Romans 12. Romans 12, Paul writes, it is a great directive. Starting in verse 1. In Romans 12, Paul says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God. Now remember, we're not in this by ourselves. We're weak. And through our weakness, he's made strong. By the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. That's a lot to take in right there. He says that we should present our bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And listen to this, verse 2. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed, how? By the renewing of your mind. There it is. Don't let the world take you over. You take over the world. How? By transformation, by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Let's go to verse 3. For I say, through the grace that is given to me, Paul's letting you know that I'm speaking through grace here. I'm nothing special. I'm Paul, even though he was very special. But he's saying, I'm saying this through grace. For I say, through the grace given to me, to everyone who is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt to each one a measure of faith. Now there he said the word think 3 times in one verse. He said the word think, he alluded to the thought process 3 times in one verse. Now he just told us to let's be transformed by the renewing of our mind. And over here, he's mentioned the word think 3 times in one verse. And he is linking our thought process to faith. He's saying that to everyone who is among you, that means to every one of us, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think soberly, as God has dealt each one a measure of faith. We're doing this today in faith. This is a message of great faith today. No one's going to change their thought process, what you've known all of your life, unless you're applying some measure of faith. And this is very important, folks. I want you to stay with me today. This is very important. This just blew up on me, this message. Now we're going to look at ways to identify those that have and have not a renewed mind. We all know who they are. Not really. We're going to look at 7 things of a person that has not a renewed mind. And we're not going to spend a long time on the negative. We're going to move right to the positive and spend our time. We're going to invest our time on evidence, the signals of a person who is applying what Paul said. I'm going to be transformed. I'm going to be improved in faith by renewing my mind. But let's look at 7 things that belong to a person that does not have a renewed mind, who's not found the value of renewing your mind, of learning something new, staying in God's Word, fellowshipping with other saints. Listen to me. This is important. This is important. A non-renewed mind. Okay? 7 things. And we're going to just breeze right through these. 7 things that I consider evidence or conditions or signals of someone who doesn't care to have a renewed mind. Number 1, they are a double-minded person. How can you have a renewed mind, according to what Paul has said, and yet be double-minded? James 1, verse 8 says, a double-minded man is unstable in all of his ways. That's pretty plain. A double-minded man, someone who can't get off the fence, is unstable in all of his ways. That's number 1. Number 2, someone who has not renewed their mind, someone who does not care to be transformed, someone that does not care to influence others, has their priorities out of order. You know anybody like that has their priorities out of order? Well, I do. Number 3, they have an inward, self-absorbed focus. They also, number 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, they have no value, they place no value on discipline or commitment. They make the same mistakes over and over and over and over and over. And they'll say, I'm sorry, that won't happen again. I won't do that again. I won't say that again. I apologize, and then they do it again. They've not renewed their mind. They place no value on discipline or commitment. They have no strategy for repairing or restoring relationships. Isn't it a shame? Folks, recently, no one that you know, recently someone passed on, and a very good friend of mine picked up the phone not to call me and tell me of how his relative suffered, but to tell me how much regret he was feeling. That was hard conversation. I mean, it was easy where I got to just be quiet for many, many, many minutes while he unloaded his guilty conscience on me, and I tried to give him the best consoling advice that I could, but he had no strategy for repairing or restoring that relationship. You want to know why? This Christian man that I'm talking about that called me hasn't renewed his mind in decades. Not to say he didn't used to have a renewed mind. He didn't used to have a fresh outlook. But I'm talking about for decades, he's done nothing to renew that mind, to become transformed. A person without a renewed mind has a contrary spirit. I'll just move on from there. And also, a person without a renewed mind has a critical nature. There's sermons in every one of those, but I'm not going to spend another second on the negative. What about someone who has got a renewed mind? Someone who has read Romans 12, the beginning here. And Romans 12 just goes on further with great instruction. Paul is a great instructor. And he says not to be conformed to this world, but be transformed, to be changed. Rise to the top, folks, by renewing your mind. Well, what's the evidence of someone who is doing just that? Let's look at it. A renewed mind has the motivation and the interest and the clarity to put God first. A renewed mind is a motivated mind. It is an interested mind. It has clarity. Not all the time. Nobody's perfect. I'm not talking about someone with a perfect thought process who does and says the right thing all the time. I'm not one of them. And I don't know many that are. Putting God first. Proverbs 3:6 says this: in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He shall direct your paths. And one of the greatest paths that we can find is to this one right here. Renew your mind. That's a pathway. That's a pathway. Renew your mind. Along the way, you're going to find healing. Along the way, you're going to find relationships. Along the way, you're going to find blessings. As you get on this pathway to renewing your mind, you're going to find victory, folks. But that's number one. Putting God first. You can always tell when there's someone that you know and you're spending time with them and they're putting God first. That's number one. Number two, a renewed mind responds versus reacts to challenges. And of course, the old analogy about that is someone gives you medicine, you go to the doctor, you're very sick, and here's a drug that's prescribed to handle this sickness. And I believe in going to doctors. I believe in taking medication. I believe in doing the natural and allowing God to do the supernatural. It gives you the drug. You take it according with food, without food. You do everything right, and you have a reaction. It didn't agree with you. You find that maybe you have an allergy to that drug, or maybe that generic just didn't work for you. You have to pick up the phone. Maybe you call the pharmacist. Maybe you call the doctor and say, this is what happened when I took this drug. I had a reaction. You want to respond. You want to take that drug, you want to take that medicine, and all of a sudden say, wow, yeah, this is working. I'm responding to the drug. A person with a renewed mind is going to respond in a positive way to life's challenges. They're not going to go fly off the handle and knee-jerk reactions every time you see them and talk to them. That's number two. A renewed mind will respond rather than react. Number three, a renewed mind filters, factors, and finds Christ-like solutions to problems. Have you found a Christ-like solution to anyone's problem lately? You may have.